The Twilight Veil, a Bedtime Chronicle Part 1. The First Watch. In the land beyond the Twilight Veil, where the moon never fully sets and the sun never completely rises, there exists a perpetual dusk that bathes everything in shades of amber and violet. This is the realm of Umbralis, a world suspended between dream and waking, where the very air shimmers with ancient magic and whispered promises. The people of this realm know a truth that outsiders cannot fathom. Every shadow cast in Umbralis has a heartbeat of its own. These living shadows, called silhouettes, move independently of their hosts, sometimes revealing the true nature of a person's soul. When a hunter named Kieran first noticed his shadow reaching toward the shadow of Elara, the healer from the eastern villages, he understood what his conscious mind had not yet admitted, that his heart had already chosen her, even as danger prowled at the edges of their world. For in Umbralis, love itself is a form of magic, and when two souls become entwined, their shadows merge into a single, more powerful form. This phenomenon, known as the binding shade, grants the bonded pair heightened senses and the ability to feel each other's presence across vast distances. But such power comes with a price. If one should die, the other's shadow fragments into 1,000 pieces, leaving them vulnerable to the creatures that hunt in the eternal twilight. And there are many such creatures. The most feared among them are the Veil Walkers, beings that appear human at first glance, beautiful even, with silver hair that flows like liquid moonlight and eyes that reflect no light at all. They move through the mists that rise each evening from the Sorrow Mere, the vast lake at the center of Umbralis, drawn by the scent of strong emotions. The Veil Walkers feed not on flesh, but on memories, particularly those touched by love or grief. A single kiss from a Veil Walker can drain decades of cherished moments, leaving their victim hollow, unable to remember why they fight, why they love, or who they once were. Kieran had seen this fate befall his mentor, a legendary hunter named Thorn, who had loved too openly and lost everything when a Veil Walker disguised as his dead wife came to him in the night. Now Thorn wandered the Whispering Woods, his vow forgotten, his purpose stolen, knowing only that something precious had been taken but unable to recall what. This is why the survivors of Umbralis have learned to love fiercely but quietly, to guard their hearts as carefully as they guard their homes. The settlements of Umbralis are built in the ancient trees, called sentinels, massive oaks and elms that have stood for 10,000 years and possess a drowsy consciousness of their own. These trees will not harbor those with cruel intentions, their branches refuse to hold the weight of the wicked, and their roots rise up to trip those who would do harm within their shelter. The village of Thornhaven, where Kieran and Elara both resided, was cradled in the boughs of 7 sentinel trees, their intertwined branches forming natural bridges, and their hollowed trunks providing warm, secure chambers for the 50 souls who called this place home. Elara possessed a gift rare even in this realm of wonders. She could hear the dreams of the dying. When someone in Thornhaven fell gravely ill or suffered a mortal wound, Elara would sit beside them and listen to the visions that played out in their fading consciousness. She believed that every person deserved to have their final dreams witnessed, to know that someone understood the last beautiful or terrible thing they would ever imagine. This gift had made her invaluable to the community, but it had also carved deep wells of sorrow within her heart, for she carried fragments of 100 deaths, 100 final moments of regret, joy, terror, and peace. It was this very gift that first brought Kieran to her door 3 seasons ago, carrying his younger sister Mira, who had been gored by a thornback, a massive boar-like creature with spines of living wood and tusks that secreted a slow-acting venom. Elara had worked through the night, drawing the poison from Myra's blood, while listening to the girl's fevered dreams of running through meadows that existed only in her imagination. Kieran had watched the healer's face transform as she absorbed his sister's visions, had seen tears stream down Elara's cheeks even as her hands remained steady, mixing antidotes and chanting the old healing songs. When Mira finally woke at dawn, weak but alive, Kieran looked at Elara and saw not just skill, but a depth of compassion that terrified and compelled him in equal measure. Since that night, Kieran had found reasons to linger near Elara's dwelling. He would bring her rare herbs from the deep forest, or offer to repair the warding charms around her home. She would smile at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and invite him in for tea made from silver moon blossoms, flowers that only bloomed in Umbralis, and had the property of revealing truth. Those who drank silver moon tea found themselves unable to lie for the span of 1 hour, which made every conversation between them both terrifying and exhilarating. In those tea-touched moments, they had shared truths they'd hidden from everyone else. Kieran's guilt over the deaths he'd caused in defense of Thornhaven, Elara's fear that absorbing so many dying dreams was slowly eroding her own identity, her worry that one day she might forget which memories were truly hers. Tonight, as the mists rose thick and early from the Sorrowmere, Kieran made his way once more to Elara's dwelling, his bow slung across his back and a bundle of nightshade berries in his pack, not the poisonous kind from other realms, but the Umbralis variety that glowed faintly blue and could, when prepared correctly, grant a few hours of dreamless sleep. He thought she might need them. The previous night, old Garrett the woodcarver had passed, and Kieran had seen Elara stumbling from the death chamber at dawn, her face pale as birch bark, her hands trembling. The eternal twilight deepened as he climbed the spiral of wooden steps that wound around the sentinel trunk. Somewhere in the distance, a veil walker sang its haunting melody, a sound like crystal bells wrapped in silk. Kieran felt his shadow pull away from his feet, stretching toward Elara's dwelling, and he wondered, not for the first time, if she felt the same pull, if her shadow reached for his when he was near. In Umbralis, such things were not spoken of lightly, for to acknowledge the binding shade was to invite it to complete itself, and completion meant vulnerability as much as it meant power. He reached her door just as she opened it, as if she had sensed his approach. Their eyes met in the amber dusk, and beneath them, their shadows rippled and reached. Part 2. The Memory Keeper. "I knew you would come," Elara said softly, stepping aside to let him enter. Her dwelling was warm, lit by luminorbs, those peculiar floating spheres of light that existed only in Umbralis, born from captured starlight and contained within glass spun from spider silk. The luminorbs responded to emotion, brightening with joy and dimming with sorrow, and tonight they flickered uncertainly between the two, sensing the complex currents between Kieran and Elara. He set down his pack and withdrew the nightshade berries, their blue glow casting strange shadows across his weathered hands. "Garrett's passing," he said simply. "I thought you might need rest without dreams tonight." Elara's expression softened with gratitude, but also something deeper, a recognition of being truly seen. In Umbralis, such understanding between two people was the first thread of what the elders called soul weaving, the gradual binding of two lives into a pattern stronger than either alone. It began with small acts of knowing, moments when one anticipated the other's needs before they were spoken. From there, it could grow into something profound and dangerous. His dreams were beautiful, Elara whispered, settling onto the cushioned bench beneath her window. He saw his wife again, his Vera, who died 20 years ago. They were young again, dancing at their bonding ceremony. She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on her knee. But there was something else in his dreams, Kieran. A warning. He saw the grief garden spreading, creeping closer to Thornhaven. Kieran felt ice settle in his chest. The grief gardens were among the most cursed places in all of Umbralis. Vast fields where flowers grew from buried sorrow. Each bloom represented a loss, a tragedy, a moment of unbearable pain that someone had tried to bury and forget. The flowers were hauntingly beautiful, with petals that ranged from deep purple to black, and they sang lullabies in the voices of the dead. But their spread was ominous, for the gardens only expanded when collective suffering grew too great. When too many people in an area had experienced trauma they refused to process. The gardens fed on suppressed grief, and those who walked among the flowers too long found themselves unable to feel anything but sadness, trapped in an endless cycle of mourning. How close? Kieran asked, though he dreaded the answer. 3 days' journey, perhaps less. The flowers are reaching out along the sorrow road. She looked up at him, storm cloud eyes reflecting the luminorb's uncertain light. We'll need to send word to the other settlements. If the gardens reach us, if they surround Thornhaven. She didn't need to finish. They both knew the stories. Entire villages had been swallowed by the grief gardens, their people transformed into mourners, pale, ghostly figures who wandered endlessly through the flowers, weeping for losses they could no longer name but could never escape. The mourners were not violent, but they were contagious in their despair. Even brief contact could leave a person melancholic for weeks, and prolonged exposure could break even the strongest spirit. Kieran moved to sit beside her, careful to leave a respectful distance between them, though their shadows had no such restraint, pooling together on the floor like dark water, finding its level. "I'll lead a hunting party tomorrow," he said. "We need to scout the garden's edge, see if there's a way to slow their growth." "There is a way," Elara said quietly. "But you won't like it." She rose and went to her shelf of ancient texts, books bound in leather made from the shed skin of metamorphs, creatures that could change their form at will and whose discarded skins held the memory of every shape they'd ever taken. These were precious volumes, passed down through generations of healers, containing knowledge both wonderful and terrible. Elara withdrew one tome, its cover marked with the symbol of a weeping eye. "The gardens can be held back by the ritual of emotional offering," she read, her voice steady despite the gravity of the words. "But it requires someone to willingly give up their happiest memory, to sacrifice their joy so that others might be protected from the spread of sorrow." She looked up at him. The memory must be genuine, powerful, and freely given. Once offered to. Elara stood and went to the window, looking out at Thornhaven in the amber twilight. In the distance, she could see something that hadn't been there before, a thin line of flowers on the horizon, but they were different now. The purple-black blooms had transformed into softer colors, deep blues and gentle silvers, the colors of tears cried and released rather than tears suppressed. The grief gardens were changing, becoming what They were always meant to be. She felt Kieran's presence behind her, his hand finding hers. Through their binding, she felt his determination to learn every facet of her, to know her so well that no copy could ever fool him. And she felt her own matching resolve to truly see him, to pay attention to every detail, every quirk, every subtle shift of emotion. The mark of acceptance glowed softly in their merged shadow, a reminder of what they'd chosen. To love despite the fear, to stay vulnerable despite the danger, to know each other completely even though such knowledge required constant, devoted attention. It was, Elara thought, exactly the kind of love worth living for. The gardens, that memory is gone forever, not just forgotten, but erased from existence, as if it never happened. Kieran felt something twist in his chest. His happiest memory was easy to identify. It was the night 3 months ago when Elara had finished healing a child's fever, and it turned to him with such pure relief and joy that she'd embraced him without thinking. They had stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, and for those few precious moments, all the darkness of Umbralis had seemed distant and powerless. To lose that memory, to have it unmade. "There must be another way," he said roughly. "Perhaps," Elara agreed, closing the book. "But if there isn't, if it comes to that." She met his eyes. "I would do it. I would give my happiest memory to protect Thornhaven, to protect the people I've cared for." "What is your happiest memory?" The question escaped him before he could stop it. Too intimate, too revealing. Elara smiled, sad and knowing. "I think you already know, Kieran." Before he could respond, a sound split the twilight, the warning bells of Thornhaven, bronze and urgent. They both moved at once, Kieran grabbing his bow while Elara seized her healing satchel. They descended the spiral stairs together, the shadows racing ahead of them, merged now into a single flowing form. The village square was in controlled chaos. Hunters and defenders were assembling, while elders ushered children into the safety of the innermost dwellings. Mira, Kieran's sister, now fully recovered and training as a hunter herself, ran up to them. "Ravenwolves," she gasped. "A pack of them, coming from the north." Torvin's scouting party spotted them, at least 20. Ravenwolves were not true wolves, but something far worse. They were creatures born from broken oaths and betrayed trusts, manifesting in the physical world as massive lupin beasts with feathers instead of fur and eyes that burned with accusatory fire. Each raven wolf carried the weight of a specific betrayal. Some were born from broken marriage vows, others from shattered promises between friends or family. They hunted those who had committed similar betrayals, but in their hunger, they would attack anyone, as if punishing the world for its capacity for faithlessness. Their bite did not kill, but it inflicted a wound that never fully healed, a pain that echoed the original betrayal that had created the beast. Worse still, raven wolves possessed an ability that made them particularly terrifying. They could sense the binding shade between two people. The stronger the connection, the more the raven wolves were drawn to it, as if the depth of love and trust between bonded pairs was an offense to creatures born from love's betrayal. Kieran and Elara exchanged a look, both understanding the danger immediately. Their shadows were already merging when they stood close. If the raven wolves came near, they would sense it, and they would come for them specifically. "We need to separate," Elara said, but Kieran shook his head. If we separate, we're weaker. The binding isn't complete yet. We're in the worst possible position, connected enough to draw them, but not bonded enough to fight them effectively. Then we complete it, Elara said, her voice suddenly fierce. We accept the binding shade fully right now, and we use that strength to help defend Thornhaven. The choice hung between them, heavy with implication. To complete the binding shade was to link their lives irrevocably, to accept that if one died, the other would be left shattered. But it was also to gain the full power of their merged shadows, enhanced reflexes, shared senses, the ability to fight as one even when physically apart. Around them, hunters were taking positions in the trees, archers readying arrows tipped with iron wood, the only substance that could truly harm ravenwolves. The twilight seemed to deepen, and in the distance, they could hear the sound that gave ravenwolves their name, a cry that was part raven's call, part wolf's howl, echoing with the anguish of every betrayal that had birthed them. Kieran reached out and took Elara's hand. The moment their skin touched, their shadows exploded into motion, swirling up around them like dark flames, then crashing together and reforming as a single, coherent entity, larger, more defined, pulsing with a deep purple light. The binding shade was complete. Kieran gasped as his senses suddenly expanded. He could feel Elara's heartbeat as if it were his own, could sense her fear and her courage and her love all at once. And she could feel him, his determination, his protective fury, and beneath it all, a tenderness so profound it made her eyes sting with tears. "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. And as the first raven wolves burst from the tree line, eyes burning with betrayal's fire, Kieran and Elara stood side by side, their merged shadows stretching out before them like a shield, ready to defend not just their home, but the love they had finally claimed. Part 3. The Battle of Broken Oaths. The raven wolves moved like liquid shadow given predatory form, their feathers catching the amber twilight and scattering it into fragments of accusatory light. Each beast was the size of a horse, their movements unnaturally fluid, as if they existed slightly out of phase with the world around them. The lead ravenwolf, larger than the rest, wore feathers of deepest black shot through with veins of crimson, a creature born from betrayal so profound it had taken on the color of heartbreak itself. Kieran drew an arrow, feeling Elara's presence beside him like a second heartbeat, and for the first time, he understood the true nature of their binding. He could sense where she was looking, could feel her assessing which villagers were most vulnerable, calculating who would need healing first, and she could feel his hunter's instincts, the way he tracked each wolf's movement, predicting their attack patterns before they struck. The first wave came fast. Raven wolves didn't fight like ordinary beasts. They attacked in patterns that mimicked the betrayals that had created them. Some lunged forward, then retreated at the last moment, embodying promises made and broken. Others circled, drawing their prey into false security before striking from an unexpected angle, like trust slowly eroded then shattered. This was why they were so deadly. They fought with the unpredictability of faithlessness itself. But Kieran and Elara, bound now by their completed shade, moved with perfect synchronization. When Kieran fired an arrow at one wolf, Elara was already preparing a healing draft for the hunter on the other side of the square. When Elara sensed danger approaching from behind, Kieran spun and loosed an arrow without conscious thought, as if her awareness was his own. The battle raged around them, and Kieran noticed something he'd never seen before in all his years of fighting. The sentinel trees themselves were participating, their ancient branches dipping low to sweep raven wolves off their feet, their roots rising to trip the beasts mid-leap. The trees had always protected Thornhaven, but this was different. They were actively fighting, moving with a speed that belied their age. He realized then what the elders had always hinted at, but never fully explained. The sentinel trees fed on hope and courage. When the people of Thornhaven fought with true heart, when they stood together despite their fear, the trees drew strength from that emotional energy and became more than mere shelter. They became guardians. A cry of pain drew Kieran's attention. Young Torvin, barely 16 summers old, had been caught by one of the raven wolves, its jaws clamped around his shoulder. The boy would survive. Raven wolf bites were rarely fatal, but Kieran could see the moment the creature's venom took effect. Torvin's eyes glazed with a peculiar pain, and Kieran knew the boy was now experiencing the echo of whatever betrayal had birthed this particular beast. He would carry that phantom pain for the rest of his life, a constant reminder of faithlessness, even though Torvin himself had done nothing wrong. Elara was already moving toward the wounded boy, but 3 more raven wolves blocked her path. Kieran felt her frustration, her desperate need to reach the injured, and he made a decision. Drawing on the power of their binding shade, he released what the hunters called a shadow strike, a technique that only those with completed bindings could perform. His merged shadow detached from his body and shot across the square like a thrown spear, solid and sharp as steel. It struck 2 of the raven wolves, not killing them, but driving them back long enough for Elara to reach Torvin. But shadow strikes came with a cost. Each time a binding shade was used as a weapon, it consumed a memory from one of the bonded pair. Not the whole memory, but small details, fragments of experience that would slowly fade. Kieran felt something slip away, some minor moment from his childhood, gone now like morning mist. It was the price of their power, the reason why those with completed bindings rarely lived to old age with all their memories intact. As Elara knelt beside Torvin, she pulled from her satchel what appeared to be a small crystal vial containing liquid moonlight. This was essence of clarity, a rare substance that could only be harvested during the 3 nights each year when both of Umbralis's moons aligned perfectly. The essence couldn't heal physical wounds, but it could cleanse spiritual ones, and it was the only thing that could ease the phantom pain of a ravenwolf's bite. She poured it over Torvin's wound, and the boy gasped as the echoing agony of betrayal faded to a dull ache. It wouldn't vanish completely. No ravenwolf wound ever did, but it would be bearable now, manageable. The battle was turning. The hunters of Thornhaven were skilled, and with the sentinel trees fighting alongside them and Kieran and Elara's binding shade coordinating the defense, they were driving the pack back. But Kieran sensed something wrong. The lead ravenwolf, the one with crimson-veined feathers, hadn't attacked yet. It sat at the edge of the tree line, watching with those burning eyes, and Kieran realized with growing dread what it was doing. Ravenwolves were more intelligent than common beasts. The pack leaders possessed what the old texts called betrayal memory, the ability to absorb and remember every act of faithlessness that occurred in their territory. This one had been watching, learning the patterns of Thornhaven's defense, studying how the binding shade worked between Kieran and Elara. It was waiting for the moment when they were most vulnerable, when they had expended the most energy and their shade was weakest. And that moment was now. The crimson-veined Ravenwolf moved with terrifying speed, covering the distance to Kieran and Elara in 3 massive bounds. But it didn't attack them directly. Instead, it released a howl that shook the very air, a sound that carried with it the emotional weight of the betrayal that had created it. This was its unique ability, born from whatever profound faithlessness had brought it into being. The howl was a weapon that targeted bonds themselves, seeking to create doubt, suspicion, and mistrust between those connected by love. Kieran felt it slam into him like a physical force. Suddenly, unbidden thoughts rose in his mind. What if Elara only accepted the binding out of desperation? What if she doesn't truly love me, but simply needed the protection? What if I'm just convenient, just useful? The thoughts were poison, and he knew they came from the Ravenwolf's howl, but knowing didn't make them less powerful. Beside him, Elara staggered, and through their connection, he felt her own doubts. What if Kieran only bound himself to me out of guilt for his sister's injury? What if he feels obligated, trapped? What if he'll come to resent me? This was how the crimson-veined Ravenwolf hunted. It didn't need to bite or claw. It simply planted seeds of mistrust, and those seeds would grow and grow until the bond between 2 people shattered from within, creating yet another betrayal to feed the Ravenwolf population. But Kieran and Elara had something the Ravenwolf hadn't accounted for. Their binding wasn't new. They'd been drawn to each other for seasons, building trust through countless small moments, through silver moon tea conversations and shared silences and acts of knowing. The foundation was strong, built on truth and time. Kieran reached for Elara's hand, and she gripped his fiercely. Through their touch, through their binding, they shared not words but raw emotion, the truth of what they felt, unmistakable and clear. The doubts began to crumble, unable to stand against the reality of their connection. Together, they drew on their binding shade one more time, pouring everything they had into it. The shadow rose up between them and the crimson-veined Ravenwolf, and this time it took a different form. Not a weapon, but a mirror. The shadow mirror was the rarest manifestation of a binding shade, achievable only when 2 people were completely honest with each other, when there were no secrets left between them. The Ravenwolf saw itself reflected in that shadow mirror, and for the first time, it saw the truth of what it was. Not a creature of righteous vengeance, but a monument of pain, eternally reliving the moment of betrayal that had created it. The reflection showed the Ravenwolf not as it believed itself to be, but as it truly was, a victim of faithlessness, transformed into a perpetrator of suffering. The creature recoiled, its howl turning from aggressive to anguished. It turned and fled into the forest, its pack following, not in fear, but in something closer to shame. Ravenwolves created by the shadow mirror technique rarely attacked the same place twice. The self-knowledge was too painful, too revealing. Silence fell over Thornhaven. The sentinel trees settled back into their ancient stillness, satisfied. Hunters lowered their bows and tended to the wounded. Elara swayed with exhaustion, and Kieran caught her, holding her steady. Their binding shade had dimmed, flickering weakly on the ground, but it was still there, still whole. Another memory gone? Elara asked softly, her head resting against his shoulder. A small one, Kieran admitted. I can't remember what my mother's garden smelled like. I know she had one. I know I loved it, but the scent is gone. I lost something too, Elara said, the sound of my father's laugh. I remember that he laughed, that it made me happy, but I can't hear it anymore. They stood together in the aftermath, surrounded by their people. Their shadows merged into one. The cost of their power was real, and it would only grow with time. But in this moment, holding each other as the eternal twilight settled once more into its peaceful amber glow, they both knew the same truth. Some things were worth the price. Part 4. The Dreamer's Path. 3 days passed after the RAVENWOLF attack, and Thornhaven settled into the careful rhythm of healing. But the threat of the Grief Garden still loomed, and Elara found herself standing before the Council of Echoes, a gathering of the 5 eldest members of the settlement, each of whom carried the title of Echo because they remembered not only their own lives, but fragments of their ancestors' lives as well. This was one of the strangest gifts in all of Umbralis. When a person reached their 60th year, if they had lived with wisdom and compassion, they began to experience ancestral echo, memories that belonged to their grandparents, great-grandparents, and those who came before would surface in dreams and quiet moments, not complete memories, but impressions, feelings, and sometimes crucial knowledge. The echoes served as living libraries, repositories of generations of experience. But the gift came with a burden. As more ancestral memories accumulated, it became increasingly difficult to remember which experiences were truly one's own. The eldest echo, a woman named Thessaly, whose hair had turned the silver-white color of first snow, spoke with a voice that seemed to carry multiple timbres, as if several people spoke through her at once. "The Grief Gardens advance," she said. "We have perhaps 2 days before they reach the outer markers of our territory. The flowers sing louder each night." Kieran stood beside Elara, their merged shadow a constant presence now. "The emotional offering," he said. "It's our only option." "Perhaps not," said another echo, a man named Corvus, whose eyes held the distant look of someone perpetually seeing into the past. "There's another way, spoken of in my grandfather's grandfather's memories. The path of the dreamer, a journey into the somnus labyrinth." Elara felt a chill run through her. She had heard whispers of the somnus labyrinth, that impossible place that existed only in the collective unconscious of Umbralis. It was said to be a maze built from the dreams and nightmares of every person who had ever lived in this realm, a place where the boundaries between sleeping and waking dissolved entirely. Those who entered the labyrinth sought the chamber at its heart, where the Dreamweaver dwelled. The Dreamweaver was not a person but a force, an entity that embodied the creative and destructive power of imagination itself. It could reshape reality, rewrite the rules of existence, but only for those who could navigate its trials. The Dreamweaver demanded that visitors prove their worth by confronting the deepest truths about themselves, the parts they kept hidden, the fears they refused to name, the desires they wouldn't admit. Many who entered the somnus labyrinth never returned, lost forever in corridors of their own self-deception. What would the Dreamweaver offer us? Elara asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The power to transform the Grief Gardens," Thessaly said. "Not to hold them back or sacrifice our joy to contain them, but to change their very nature. The Dreamweaver can alter what things mean. It could transform the gardens from symbols of suppressed pain into gardens of accepted loss, places of healing rather than curse. But the price, Kieran said quietly. The price, Corvus agreed, is that whoever makes the journey must share their most vulnerable truth with the Dreamweaver. Not just speak it, but live it. Experience it as if for the first time, with all the raw emotion intact. And the Dreamweaver will share that truth with anyone who asks forever. Your deepest secret becomes public knowledge, available to anyone who seeks it. Elara and Kieran exchanged a long look. Through their binding, they could feel each other's hesitation, each other's fear. But they could also feel something else, the determination to protect Thornhaven, and the quiet courage that came from knowing they would face this together. "We'll go," Elara said. "Both of you?" Thessaly asked, surprised. "The labyrinth typically only admits one traveler at a time." "We're bound," Kieran said simply. "Where one goes, the other follows. Our shadow is one." The echoes conferred in whispers that sounded like autumn leaves rustling through multiple generations. Finally, Thessaly nodded. "Very well. But understand this, because you are bound. The Dreamweaver may demand a truth from each of you, or it may demand a single truth you share. You won't know until you stand before it." That night, as the amber twilight deepened toward its darkest hour, Elara and Kieran prepared for their journey. The entrance to the Somnus Labyrinth could only be accessed through a specific ritual involving sleepwalkers' dust, a fine, glittering powder made from the crystallized tears of those who suffered from the peculiar condition of conscious dreaming. In Umbralis, some individuals were cursed or blessed with a condition where they remained partially aware while dreaming, able to remember every detail of their sleep visions but unable to ever feel fully rested. These sleepwalkers move through life in a state of perpetual exhaustion, their tears containing traces of the boundary between sleep and wake. When those tears were collected and crystallized, they created a substance that could temporarily blur the line between worlds. Mira helped them prepare, grinding the sleepwalkers' dust with herbs of lucidity, plants that grew only in windowsills, fed by both moonlight and the exhalations of sleeping people. "Promise me you'll come back," she said to her brother, her voice tight with worry. "I promise," Kieran said, though they both knew it was a promise he might not be able to keep. Elara drew a circle on the floor of her dwelling using the prepared dust, and she and Kieran sat facing each other within it, their hands clasped, their merged shadow pooling around them. They spoke the words that Thessaly had taught them, old words in a language that predated even the sentinel trees, words that meant something like, "Let me walk between truth and illusion." The world shifted. One moment they were in Elara's warm dwelling, surrounded by the familiar scent of herbs and the gentle glow of luminorbs. The next, they stood at the entrance to a vast corridor that seemed to be constructed from solidified fog and crystallized starlight. The walls shifted and breathed like living things, and Elara realized they were made of compressed dreams. She could see images flickering within them, fragments of other people's sleep visions pressed together like layers of translucent stone. "Stay close," Kieran said, though their binding made separation nearly impossible. They could feel each other's presence like a tether, unbreakable and constant. They began to walk. The Somnus Labyrinth revealed itself in stages, each corridor presenting a different trial. The first passage was lined with mirrors, but these were no ordinary reflections. Each mirror showed not how they appeared, but how others perceived them, and the images were brutally honest. Elara saw herself through the eyes of those she'd failed to save, her face twisted with guilt and inadequacy. Kieran saw himself as Mira had seen him the night their parents died, distant and drowning in his own grief, unavailable when she needed him most. They walked past these painful truths, holding tight to each other, their binding providing an anchor against the despair the mirrors tried to invoke. The second trial involved what appeared to be doorways, hundreds of them lining both sides of a long hall. Each door was labeled with a different choice they'd made in their lives, and through each door, they could glimpse the life they would have lived if they'd chosen differently. Kieran saw a door labeled Stayed in the Capital. Through it, he glimpsed himself as a wealthy merchant, comfortable and safe, but hollow-eyed and alone. Elara saw a door labeled Refuse the Healer's Gift. Beyond it, she saw herself unburdened by others' dying dreams, but also isolated, unable to connect with people because she'd closed herself off from their pain. These doors whispered seductively, offering roads not taken, suggesting it wasn't too late to turn back, to choose differently even now. But Elara and Kieran walked forward, understanding that the life they'd built together, with all its dangers and sorrows, was the one they wanted. The third trial was silence. They entered a chamber where no sound could exist, not even the sound of their own heartbeats or breathing. In that absolute quiet, they couldn't speak to reassure each other, couldn't hear each other move. For long moments, the silence pressed in like something physical, threatening to make them forget that the other person was even there. But they still had their binding. Even in perfect silence, they could feel each other's presence, could sense each other's determination. Kieran squeezed Elara's hand, and she squeezed back, and they walked through the silent chamber together until sound gradually returned. Finally, they reached the heart of the labyrinth. The chamber was circular, its ceiling lost in darkness that seemed to stretch into infinity. In the center stood a figure that was and wasn't there. The Dreamweaver manifested as a constantly shifting form, sometimes appearing human, sometimes animal, sometimes as pure light or shadow or something that had no name. Its voice, when it spoke, came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You come seeking transformation," the Dreamweaver said, its words resonating in their bones. "You wish to change the nature of the grief gardens, to transmute sorrow into healing. This I can do. But first, you must pay the price. You are bound, and so I offer you a choice. Each of you may share a separate vulnerable truth, or you may share one truth together, a secret you hold jointly, something that belongs to both of you equally." Elara and Kieran looked at each other, and through their binding, they communicated without words. They both knew what their shared secret was, the truth that belonged to them equally. They were afraid, not of death, not of the creatures of Umbralis, but of losing each other. They were terrified that their binding, which gave them such strength, also meant that if one fell, the other would be destroyed. They lived every day with the knowledge that their greatest source of power was also their ultimate vulnerability, and sometimes, in quiet moments, they wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. "We choose to share one truth," Kieran said. "Then speak it," the Dreamweaver commanded. "Speak it and live it here now." Part 5. The Truth Unfolds. And so they spoke. Together, their voices blending into a single confession, Elara and Kieran told the Dreamweaver their deepest fear, that their love, which should have been their greatest joy, had become a source of constant terror, that every moment of happiness was shadowed by the knowledge that it could all be torn away in an instant, that sometimes, in the darkest hours, they wondered if it would have been better never to have bound at all, to have remained separate and safe, rather than united and vulnerable. As they spoke, the chamber around them transformed. The Dreamweaver's power made their fear tangible, real. They experienced phantom versions of loss. Kieran felt Elara die in his arms over and over, each death different, each one shattering his shadow into fragments. Elara lived through endless scenarios of Kieran's demise, felt her own shadow crack and splinter with each imagined loss. The pain was exquisite, unbearable, and utterly real in those moments. But something unexpected happened as they lived through these phantom deaths. With each imagined loss, they also experienced something else, the memory of every moment that had made the risk worthwhile. The first time Elara had laughed at one of Kieran's terrible jokes, the night he'd stayed up with her while she nursed a dying elder, simply holding her hand. The morning they'd watched the twin moons set together, saying nothing, needing no words. Every small kindness, every shared silence, every instant of understanding. The Dreamweaver's form solidified slightly, taking on an almost curious aspect. "You fear the loss," it said, "but you do not regret the love. This is rare. Most who come here with such fear wish to undo what binds them. But you would choose the same path again, even knowing the cost." "Every time," Elara said, her voice hoarse from the emotional ordeal. "Every time," Kieran echoed. The Dreamweaver extended what might have been a hand, or perhaps a tendril of living light. "Then I grant you what you seek. The grief gardens will transform. But more than that, I give you a gift, the mark of acceptance. You have acknowledged your fear and chosen love anyway. This mark will be visible to all who look upon you, your shared truth made manifest. But it will also serve as protection. Those who see it will know that you have faced the Dreamweaver and emerged with your bond intact. Even the darkest creatures of Umbralis respect such courage." The Dreamweaver touched their merged shadow, and suddenly a pattern appeared within it, an intricate design that resembled intertwined branches bearing both flowers and thorns. The mark of acceptance would be visible whenever their shadow merged, a testament to their vulnerability and their strength. But as the mark settled into their shadow, Elara gasped. She was experiencing a surge of visions, not her own memories, but something the Dreamweaver was sharing. She saw the true origin of the grief gardens, a history that had been lost to time. The gardens had not always been cursed. Thousands of years ago, when Umbralis was young, they had been places of pilgrimage where people came to consciously grieve, to process their losses in a healthy way. The flowers were called memory blooms, and they had been cultivated by an order of healers known as the sorrow shepherds. These shepherds understood that grief unacknowledged became toxic, but grief honored and witnessed could transform into wisdom and compassion. The sorrow shepherds had possessed a unique ability. They could absorb grief from others, holding it temporarily in their own hearts, helping people process losses that felt too overwhelming to bear alone. They were trained from childhood to carry sorrow without being consumed by it, to transform pain through witness and ritual. Each shepherd bore tattoos called grief maps, intricate patterns on their skin that changed and evolved with every sorrow they helped process, creating a living record of all the pain they had transmuted into healing. But the order had fallen centuries ago, destroyed not by external enemies, but by internal corruption. Some shepherds had grown addicted to the intensity of others' grief, seeking out not to heal but to experience the profound emotions secondhand. They became known as grief drinkers, and they had twisted the sacred gardens into places of perpetual suffering, feeding on the sorrow of those who came seeking help. When the other shepherds realized what was happening, they had tried to stop the corrupted ones, but the damage was done. The gardens transformed, and the order dissolved, its knowledge scattered and lost. That's why the garden spread, Elara whispered, understanding flooding through her. They're trying to return to their original purpose, but without the shepherds to guide them, they can only consume grief, not transform it. Precisely, the Dreamweaver said. And now you understand what must be done. The gardens can be healed, but they need a new sorrow shepherd, someone willing to take on that sacred duty, to help others process their losses so the gardens can return to places of healthy grieving. Kieran felt his heart sink. Elara already carries so much, he said. She hears the dreams of the dying. To also become a sorrow shepherd. I'll do it, Elara said quietly. It's what I've been doing all along, isn't it? Helping people face their final moments, witnessing their last dreams. This is just more of the same, more intentional. The Dreamweaver turned its constantly shifting attention to Kieran. And you, Hunter? What will you do while your bound partner carries the sorrows of Thornhaven? Kieran thought of his vow, his life spent taking life to protect life, an idea formed, born from the same instinct that made him a good hunter, the understanding of balance, of ecosystem, of how all things in nature connect. I'll become a life keeper, he said. If Elara tends to death and grief, I'll tend to birth and joy. I'll help bring new life into Thornhaven, not just children, but new growth, new projects, new hope. We'll balance each other. The Dreamweaver made a sound that might have been approval. The sorrow shepherd and the life keeper, bound by their shadow. Yes, this could work. The gardens will respond to your combined presence, grief acknowledged by her, joy cultivated by him, balance restored. But then the Dreamweaver's form darkened, becoming more ominous. However, there is something you must know. The reason the original shepherds fell to corruption was because of a creature that preyed upon them, the Despair Eater. It still exists, and it will be drawn to you. Elara, once you take on the shepherd's mantle, it is a being that feeds not on grief itself, but on those who absorb grief from others. It hunts healers, finding them irresistible. Elara felt Kieran's protective fury flare through their binding. What is this creature? He demanded. A Despair Eater appears as whatever you loved and lost, the Dreamweaver explained. For each person, it takes a different form, a dead parent, a lost child, a friend who betrayed you. It uses your own history of loss against you, appearing as someone you would trust, someone you would lower your defenses for. Once it gets close enough, it doesn't kill. Instead, it replaces you. Replaces? Elara asked, her voice shaking. The Despair Eater consumes your identity gradually, absorbing your memories, your personality, your very self, while simultaneously taking on your appearance and mannerisms. Over the course of several days, you cease to exist, and the despair eater becomes you. Perfectly, completely, indistinguishably. Those who love you will never know the difference. They'll simply think you've changed slightly, become a bit more melancholic perhaps, but still fundamentally you. Kieran's hand tightened on Elara's. How do we fight it? You can't, the Dreamweaver said simply. Not with weapons. The only way to survive a despair eater is to recognize it before it gets close enough to begin the replacement process. And the only way to recognize it is through absolute knowledge of each other. The creature is perfect in its mimicry, but it cannot fully replicate the depth of intimacy between bound partners. Small inconsistencies will emerge, a slightly wrong inflection, a misremembered detail, an emotional response that's a fraction off. You must know each other completely, or the despair eater will succeed. This, Elara realized, was the true test, not the trials of the labyrinth, not the sharing of their vulnerable truth, but this, the requirement to know each other so thoroughly that even a perfect copy could be detected. It would demand constant attention, constant presence, constant devotion to truly seeing each other. We accept, Elara said, and Kieran nodded his agreement. The Dreamweaver's form began to dissolve. Then go. The grief gardens are already transforming in response to your decision. You will find them changed when you return. But remember, the despair eater is patient. It may come tomorrow, or it may come years from now. You must always be vigilant. Always be certain you are with the person you bound yourself to, not a perfect copy wearing their face. The chamber began to fade, the labyrinth releasing them. The last thing they heard was the Dreamweaver's voice, softer now, almost kind. Love courageously, shepherd and keeper. Love with your eyes open. They woke in Elara's dwelling. The circle of sleepwalkers' dust scattered around them, their merged shadow bearing the new mark of acceptance, intertwined branches with flowers and thorns. Mira was dozing in a chair nearby and startled awake when they stirred. "You're back," she breathed. "How long were you gone?" "A few hours." Kieran guessed, but Mira shook her head. 3 days. We were starting to think. She couldn't finish, just pulled her brother into a fierce embrace. The Twilight Veil, a Bedtime Chronicle Part 1. The First Watch. In the land beyond the Twilight Veil, where the moon never fully sets and the sun never completely rises, there exists a perpetual dusk that bathes everything in shades of amber and violet. This is the realm of Umbralis, a world suspended between dream and waking, where the very air shimmers with ancient magic and whispered promises. The people of this realm know a truth that outsiders cannot fathom. Every shadow cast in Umbralis has a heartbeat of its own. These living shadows, called silhouettes, move independently of their hosts, sometimes revealing the true nature of a person's soul. When a hunter named Kieran first noticed his shadow reaching toward the shadow of Elara, the healer from the eastern villages, he understood what his conscious mind had not yet admitted, that his heart had already chosen her, even as danger prowled at the edges of their world. For in Umbralis, love itself is a form of magic, and when two souls become entwined, their shadows merge into a single, more powerful form. This phenomenon, known as the binding shade, grants the bonded pair heightened senses and the ability to feel each other's presence across vast distances. But such power comes with a price. If one should die, the others shadow fragments into 1,000 pieces, leaving them vulnerable to the creatures that hunt in the eternal twilight. And there are many such creatures. The most feared among them are the Veil Walkers, beings that appear human at first glance, beautiful even, with silver hair that flows like liquid moonlight and eyes that reflect no light at all. They move through the mists that rise each evening from the Sorrowmere, the vast lake at the center of Umbralis, drawn by the scent of strong emotions. The Veil Walkers feed not on flesh, but on memories, particularly those touched by love or grief. A single kiss from a Veil Walker can drain decades of cherished moments, leaving their victim hollow, unable to remember why they fight, why they love, or who they once were. Kieran had seen this fate befall his mentor, a legendary hunter named Thorn, who had loved too openly and lost everything when a Veil Walker disguised as his dead wife came to him in the night. Now Thorn wandered the Whispering Woods, his bow forgotten, his purpose stolen, knowing only that something precious had been taken but unable to recall what. This is why the survivors of Umbralis have learned to love fiercely but quietly, to guard their hearts as carefully as they guard their homes. The settlements of Umbralis are built in the ancient trees called sentinels, massive oaks and elms that have stood for 10,000 years and possess a drowsy consciousness of their own. These trees will not harbor those with cruel intentions. Their branches refuse to hold the weight of the wicked, and their roots rise up to trip those who would do harm within their shelter. The village of Thornhaven, where Kieran and Elara both resided, was cradled in the boughs of 7 sentinel trees, their intertwined branches forming natural bridges, and their hollowed trunks providing warm, secure chambers for the 50 souls who called this place home. Elara possessed a gift rare even in this realm of wonders. She could hear the dreams of the dying. When someone in Thornhaven fell gravely ill or suffered a mortal wound, Elara would sit beside them and listen to the visions that played out in their fading consciousness. She believed that every person deserved to have their final dreams witnessed, to know that someone understood the last beautiful or terrible thing they would ever imagine. This gift had made her invaluable to the community, but it had also carved deep wells of sorrow within her heart, for she carried fragments of 100 deaths, 100 final moments of regret, joy, terror, and peace. It was this very gift that first brought Kieran to her door 3 seasons ago, carrying his younger sister Mira, who had been gored by a thornback, a massive boar-like creature with spines of living wood and tusks that secreted a slow-acting venom. Elara had worked through the night, drawing the poison from Myra's blood while listening to the girl's fevered dreams of running through meadows that existed only in her imagination. Kieran had watched the healer's face transform as she absorbed his sister's visions, had seen tears stream down Elara's cheeks even as her hands remained steady, mixing antidotes and chanting the old healing songs. When Mira finally woke at dawn, weak but alive, Kieran looked at Elara and saw not just skill, but a depth of compassion that terrified and compelled him in equal measure. Since that night, Kieran had found reasons to linger near Elara's dwelling. He would bring her rare herbs from the deep forest, or offer to repair the warding charms around her home. She would smile at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, and invite him in for tea made from silver moon blossoms, flowers that only bloomed in Umbralis, and had the property of revealing truth. Those who drank Silver Moon tea found themselves unable to lie for the span of 1 hour, which made every conversation between them both terrifying and exhilarating. In those tea-touched moments, they had shared truths they'd hidden from everyone else. Kieran's guilt over the deaths he'd caused in defense of Thornhaven, Elara's fear that absorbing so many dying dreams was slowly eroding her own identity, her worry that one day she might forget which memories were truly hers. Tonight, as the mists rose thick and early from the Sorrowmere, Kieran made his way once more to Elara's dwelling, his bow slung across his back, and a bundle of nightshade berries in his pack, not the poisonous kind from other realms, but the Umbralis variety that glowed faintly blue and could, when prepared correctly, grant a few hours of dreamless sleep. He thought she might need them. The previous night, old Garrett the woodcarver had passed, and Kieran had seen Elara stumbling from the death chamber at dawn, her face pale as birch bark, her hands trembling. The eternal twilight deepened as he climbed the spiral of wooden steps that wound around the sentinel trunk. Somewhere in the distance, a Veil Walker sang its haunting melody, a sound like crystal bells wrapped in silk. Kieran felt his shadow pull away from his feet, stretching toward Elara's dwelling, and he wondered, not for the first time, if she felt the same pull, if her shadow reached for his when he was near. In Umbralis, such things were not spoken of lightly, for to acknowledge the binding shade was to invite it to complete itself, and completion meant vulnerability as much as it meant power. He reached her door just as she opened it, as if she had sensed his approach. Their eyes met in the amber dusk, and beneath them, their shadows rippled and reached. Part 6. The transformation begins. The next morning brought changes to Thornhaven that no one had anticipated. When the villagers woke, they found that the sentinel trees had produced a rare phenomenon, remembrance fruit. These were small, translucent orbs that grew only once every few generations, appearing when the trees sensed a significant shift in the spiritual balance of their territory. Each fruit contained a preserved memory, typically from someone who had lived and died in the protection of the sentinels, and eating the fruit allowed the consumer to experience that memory as if it were their own. The appearance of remembrance fruit was considered a blessing, a gift from the ancient trees to help guide the living through difficult transitions. But it also came with a warning etched in the bark of the eldest sentinel. Memory shared is burden halved, but truth witnessed is responsibility accepted. Those who ate the fruit would gain wisdom, but they would also inherit the obligation to honor what they learned. Elara found herself drawn to the transformed grief gardens that very day. Kieran accompanied her, their merged shadow marking them clearly with the mark of acceptance, and as they approached the boundary where the gardens began, they noticed something remarkable. The flowers had indeed changed. The oppressive purple-black blooms were now interspersed with silver and blue blossoms that swayed gently despite the absence of wind. But more striking was the sound. The flowers no longer sang lullabies in the voices of the dead. Instead, they hummed a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to harmonize with the heartbeat of anyone who listened. This was the song of processing, an ancient sound that the original memory blooms had produced. It didn't impose grief upon listeners, but rather created a safe space where existing grief could be acknowledged and released. People could sit among these new flowers and weep freely, their tears watering the blooms and transforming suppressed sorrow into accepted loss. As Elara stood at the garden's edge, she felt a mantle of sorrow shepherd settling upon her like a physical weight. Her skin began to tingle, and when she looked down at her arms, she saw the first lines of her grief map appearing, faint silver tracings that would grow and evolve with each person she helped. The marks didn't hurt, but they felt warm, alive, as if they were being drawn by invisible hands that had waited centuries to continue their work. "It's beautiful," Kieran said softly, tracing one of the emerging patterns with his finger. Through their binding, she could feel his awe and his concern in equal measure. But as the day progressed, they discovered that Kieran's role as life keeper came with its own physical manifestation. When he returned to his dwelling to gather his hunting gear, he found that his weapons had transformed. His bow was no longer simply wood and string. It had become something called a Genesis bow, carved from living wood that continued to grow even after being shaped. Small green shoots and leaves emerged from its limbs, and when he drew back the string, he could feel life energy thrumming through it. The arrows in his quiver had changed as well. Half of them remained normal, tipped with ironwood for hunting and defense, but the other half had become seed arrows, projectiles that, when fired into barren ground, would instantly germinate and grow into useful plants, food crops, medicinal herbs, or even young trees. A life keeper's purpose wasn't just to celebrate existing joy, but to literally plant the seeds of new growth, new possibilities, new life. That afternoon, Kieran tested the seed arrows in the clearing near Thornhaven, and the villagers gathered to watch in wonder as each arrow he fired burst into immediate growth upon impact. Within moments, a small grove of fruit trees stood where there had been empty earth, their branches already heavy with ripe offerings. The people cheered, and Kieran felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose that went beyond protection, beyond survival. He was creating abundance. But that night, as Elara and Kieran lay together in her dwelling, the luminorbs dimmed to a soft glow. They experienced the first test of their new vigilance. Elara woke suddenly, sensing something wrong. Kieran lay beside her, but something about him fell off. His breathing pattern was slightly irregular, a fraction too slow. Through their binding, his emotional presence felt muted, as if wrapped in cloth. Her heart hammering, Elara reached out and touched his face. "Kieran," she whispered, "tell me something only you would know." The figure beside her opened its eyes, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, Elara saw something wrong in them, a flatness, an emptiness. Then it smiled, and the smile was Kieran's smile, warm and genuine. "You're afraid it's already started," he said, his voice perfectly his own. "You're afraid the Despair Eater has come." "Tell me," she insisted, her hand moving to her belt where she kept a small knife. "The first time I saw you," he said, "you were singing to a dying child. You didn't know anyone was listening. The song was about a bird that flew so high it touched the stars. Your voice cracked on the last verse because you were crying, and I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, to give that child such beauty even while your own heart was breaking." Elara felt tears spring to her eyes. It was true, every word. Only Kieran knew that story. She'd never told anyone else. The muted feeling through their binding suddenly sharpened, and she realized he'd been dampening their connection intentionally, testing her, wanting to see if she could detect something wrong even with someone who appeared and sounded exactly like him. "Don't ever do that again," she said, her voice shaking between relief and anger. "I had to know you'd notice," Kieran said, pulling her close. "I had to know we could tell. The Despair Eater is patient, Elara. It could watch us for months, learning our patterns, perfecting its mimicry. We need to practice this, checking each other, testing each other. It's the only way we'll survive." She knew he was right, but it didn't make the test any less terrifying. They lay awake for hours after that, sharing stories and details they'd never spoken aloud before, building a library of intimate knowledge that no creature could replicate simply by watching. 2 days later, a traveler arrived in Thornhaven, something that happened rarely, as Umbralis was not a realm easily entered or exited. The man called himself Soren, and he bore the weathered look of someone who had seen too much. He wore a cloak made from shadowy fabric, a material that could only be created in the deepest parts of the Whispering Woods, where shadows grew thick enough to touch and pull like taffy. The fabric had the unusual property of absorbing light, making the wearer difficult to notice even in direct view. It was often worn by scouts and spies, or by those who had reasons to travel unseen. Soren claimed to be a lore keeper, one of the wandering scholars who collected stories and knowledge from across Umbralis. Lore keepers were respected but also viewed with caution. They served no one settlement, owed allegiance to no leader, and their primary loyalty was to knowledge itself. They would share information freely, but they would also take it freely, and some accused them of caring more about stories than about the people who lived them. "I heard there was a new sorrow shepherd," Soren said when he was brought before the Council of Echoes. His gaze found Elara, studied the emerging grief map on her arms with interest that bordered on hunger, and a life keeper as well. The old balance returning. This is worth recording. Thessaly, the eldest echo, regarded him with ancient eyes. "What brings you to Thornhaven, Lore Keeper? We are far from the usual routes." "I follow stories to their source," Soren replied, "and I've heard whispers of something else, whispers of a binding shade that bore the mark of acceptance. Such a thing hasn't been seen in 300 years. I had to witness it myself." There was something in the way he said "witness" that made Elara uncomfortable, as if he were already imagining how to categorize them, how to reduce their lived experience to words on a page. But lore keepers did serve a purpose. They ensured that knowledge wasn't lost, that the mistakes and triumphs of one generation could inform the next. "You may stay," Corvus, another echo, decided, "but you will follow our customs. What you learn here, you may record, but you will also contribute. Lore keepers must give knowledge as well as take it." Soren inclined his head in agreement. "Of course. In fact, I bring news from the western settlements. There have been sightings of a creature no one has seen in over a century, a possibility phoenix." A ripple of shocked whispers ran through the assembled villagers. Kieran leaned close to Elara. "What's a possibility phoenix?" he whispered. It was Soren who answered, his lore keeper's training making him aware of even quiet questions. Possibility Phoenix is a creature born when someone makes a choice so significant, so divergent from the path they were on, that their unlived life gains enough energy to manifest physically. The phoenix appears as a great bird made of shimmering, translucent flames that show glimpses of what might have been. It seeks out the person whose choice created it, not to harm them, but to show them the life they didn't choose. Why would one appear now? Thessaly asked, her voice troubled. That's what I've been trying to determine, Soren said. Possibility phoenixes only appear when someone makes a choice that affects not just themselves, but the entire fabric of their community. A choice that alters destiny on a collective level. His eyes fixed on Elara and Kieran. Tell me, have either of you made such a choice recently? Elara and Kieran exchanged a look, their merged shadow rippling. They had made such a choice, accepting the mantle of Sorrow Shepherd and Life Keeper, agreeing to transform the Grief Gardens, completing their binding despite the dangers. Any one of those decisions might have been enough. Together, they had fundamentally altered the course of Thornhaven's future. The Phoenix will come here, Soren said, reading their silence correctly. And when it does, you'll see what you gave up. The peaceful, safe life you could have lived if you'd chosen differently. For most people, the sight drives them mad with regret. They spend the rest of their lives haunted by what might have been. But not everyone. Elara asked. Not everyone, Soren agreed. Some, the very rare few, look at the phoenix and feel only gratitude for the life they chose instead. When that happens, the phoenix doesn't vanish. It bonds with them, becoming a guardian spirit that protects them from regret and second-guessing. It ensures they never forget why they made the choice they did. Kieran felt something stir in his chest, not fear, but curiosity. Then let come, he said. We have nothing to regret. But later, alone with Elara, he wondered if that was entirely true. Through their binding, she felt his doubt and sent him a wave of reassurance. They would face the possibility phoenix together, just as they faced everything else. That night, Elara began her work as Sorrow Shepherd in earnest. Old Marin, who had lost his son to a thornback attack years ago and had never properly grieved, came to her dwelling. Together, they walked to the transformed Grief Gardens, and Elara placed her hand on his shoulder as the memory blooms hummed their song of processing. She felt his grief flow into her, absorbed it, held it in her heart alongside his, and her grief map grew a new tracery of silver, a pattern that represented a father's love and loss. When it was done, Marin wept, but his tears were clean, releasing rather than suppressing. He looked lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been acknowledged and could now be set down. He thanked Elara with such profound gratitude that she felt the purpose of her new role settle more firmly into her bones. But she also felt the cost. The grief she'd absorbed from Marin didn't disappear. She carried it now, would carry it always as part of her grief map. And there would be more, many more, as others came to her with their losses. She would become a living repository of Thornhaven's sorrows, and the weight of that would only grow. She returned home to find Kieran waiting with something new, a small tree sapling in a pot, grown from one of his seed arrows. I thought, he said quietly, that for every grief you carry, I should plant something. Balance. You take in sorrow, I create life. We keep each other from tipping too far in either direction. Elara looked at the sapling, then at Kieran, and through their binding, she felt the perfect symmetry of what they were becoming. two halves of a necessary whole, darkness and light, grief and joy, death and life, forever intertwined. Part 7. Wings of What Might Have Been. The Possibility Phoenix arrived on the 7th night after Soren's warning, and its coming was heralded by a phenomenon that shook everyone who witnessed it. The eternal twilight of Umbralis flickered. For just a moment, the amber-violet sky brightened almost to daylight, then darkened nearly to true night, as if reality itself couldn't decide which timeline was real. In that moment of temporal uncertainty, the phoenix descended. It was more magnificent and more terrible than any description could capture. Its body was formed from chronoflame, a fire that burned not with heat, but with time itself, each tongue of flame showing a different moment from a different possible life. As it circled above Thornhaven, everyone who looked upon it saw glimpses of their own unlived paths, the versions of themselves they might have become if they'd chosen differently at crucial moments. But the phoenix's attention was fixed on Elara and Kieran. It landed in the village square, its talons, which appeared solid one moment and translucent the next, gripping the ancient stone that marked Thornhaven's center. Its eyes were the most unsettling feature. They contained what the old texts called parallel sight, the ability to see not just what is, but what could have been and what still might be, all simultaneously. "Show us," Kieran said, his voice steady despite the fear threading through his veins. "Show us what we gave up." The phoenix spread its wings, and the chronoflame expanded outward, enveloping them in a cocoon of unlived possibility. Suddenly, they weren't standing in Thornhaven's square anymore. They were somewhere else, or rather, they were still themselves, but seeing through the eyes of their other selves, the versions who had chosen differently. Elara saw herself as she might have been if she'd refused the healer's gift when it first manifested in her youth. This other Elara had never heard dying dreams, had never carried the weight of others' final moments. She lived in a small cottage at the edge of settlement, working as a simple herbalist, her days filled with quiet routine. She had married a kind man, not Kieran, someone else, and they had 2 children who called her mother and looked at her with uncomplicated love. This other Elara was happy, genuinely, peacefully happy in a way that required no bravery, no sacrifice, no constant vigilance against creatures that wore the faces of the dead. She would never know what a despair eater was. She would never feel her shadow merge with another's. She would live a long, unremarkable life and die in her sleep, surrounded by grandchildren, having never once absorbed anyone's grief or carried anyone's sorrow but her own. Beside her, Kieran was seeing his own unlived life. He had never become a hunter. In this version, he had left Umbralis entirely through one of the rare portals that occasionally opened to other realms. He lived in a world of perpetual daylight, a place where shadows were just shadows and nothing more. He was wealthy there, successful, surrounded by people who admired him for his business acumen. He had a wife, not Elara. He never met Elara, and 3 children, and a house made of stone that would stand for centuries. This other Kieran never worried about ravenwolves or veil walkers. He never spent nights watching the tree line for danger. He never had to choose between his own safety and his sister's survival. He was, by any conventional measure, living a better life, safer, easier, longer. The phoenix's chronoflame burned brighter, forcing them to watch as these alternate lives played out. Years compressed into moments. They saw themselves growing older in these other lives, saw their alternate selves celebrating birthdays and holidays, weathering small domestic conflicts and finding small domestic joys. They saw themselves die, quick, painless deaths in both cases, surrounded by people who loved them, people who mourned but also celebrated lives well lived and well completed. It was everything they had given up. Safety, simplicity, the kind of love that didn't require constant vigilance or the risk of complete destruction. Children they would never have, because bringing children into their current lives felt too dangerous, too irresponsible given the threats they faced. The Phoenix watched them with its parallel sight, waiting to see which way their hearts would break, toward regret for what they'd lost, or toward gratitude for what they'd chosen. Kieran was the first to speak. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That life, it's everything most people want, everything most people should want. But it's not ours," Elara added, and through their binding, they felt each other's absolute certainty. That Elara never became a sorrow shepherd. She never helped Marin release his grief. She never transformed the grief gardens. That life is easier, but it's also smaller. That Kieran never saved Mira. Kieran continued. He left before she needed him. He's wealthy in that other life, but he abandoned his sister. He chose comfort over courage, and yes, he's happy. But he's happy because he doesn't know what he gave up. The Phoenix tilted its head, and its chronoflame shifted, showing them one more scene. The two of them as they were now, standing in Thornhaven Square, their merged shadow bearing the mark of acceptance. The flame showed them facing the Despair Eater someday, showed them growing older with their grief map and Genesis bow, showed them dying, not peacefully, not surrounded by grandchildren, but defending Thornhaven from some future threat, going down together, their shadows fragmenting simultaneously. It was a harder death, a more frightening life, and it was absolutely, completely the one they wanted. "We choose this," Elara said, reaching for Kieran's hand. "We choose the difficult path, the dangerous love, the life that matters even if it's shorter." The Phoenix's eyes flared with something that might have been approval or might have been recognition. Slowly, its form began to change. The chronoflame compressed, solidified, transforming from transparent visions of what might have been into something new. Phoenix feathers. These were rare treasures that fell from possibility phoenixes when they bonded with someone, and each feather contained a powerful gift. The feathers that fell around Elara and Kieran shimmered with golden light, and as they touched them, they understood what they had gained. The feathers were called certainty charms, and each one could be used once to dispel doubt, not just internal doubt, but doubt cast upon them by external forces. If the Despair Eater's doubt howl tried to break their bond, a certainty charm could protect them. If a Veil Walker tried to steal their memories of why they loved, a certainty charm could preserve that knowledge. If they themselves began to falter, to question their choice, a certainty charm could remind them of this moment, of the clear-eyed decision they'd made. 12 feathers fell in total, one for each year they would have together before the death the Phoenix had shown them. It was a timeline, a countdown, and also a promise. 12 years of certain purpose, 12 years of unwavering commitment, 12 years to make the difference they'd chosen to make. The Phoenix itself began to fade, but not entirely. It transformed into what Soren had called a guardian spirit, a presence that would remain with them, invisible most of the time, but always there, protecting them from the corrosive force of regret. They would never be haunted by what might have been, never wake in the night wondering if they'd made the wrong choice. The phoenix had become their shield against such doubts. As the last of the chronoflame dissipated, Soren approached them, his expression one of profound awe. I've recorded only 3 other instances of successful phoenix bonding in all my years, he said quietly. Most people crumble when confronted with what they've lost. You too, you're remarkable. But Mira, who had watched the entire event, had tears streaming down her face. 12 years, she said, her voice breaking. The phoenix showed you dying in 12 years. Kieran pulled his sister into an embrace. 12 years of living, he corrected gently. 12 years of making a difference. 12 years together. Most people get a lifetime and do nothing of consequence. We get 12 years and we transform the world. That night, the Council of Echoes called an emergency gathering. Thessaly spoke with the weight of multiple generations behind her words. The Phoenix has shown us something we needed to see. Elara and Kieran have 12 years to prepare Thornhaven, to teach us what they've learned, to establish the practices of Sorrow Shepherd and Life Keeper so firmly that when they fall, others can continue the work. Then we use every moment, Elara said. Her grief map had grown more intricate during the Phoenix's visit, new patterns emerging as she absorbed not just others' grief, but also the community's fear for her and Kieran's future. We document everything. We train apprentices. We make sure that what we've started doesn't end with us. Corvus stepped forward, his echo-touched eyes distant with ancestral memory. There's a way to extend your timeline, he said slowly. My great-great-grandmother's memories speak of something called the temporal tithe. It requires a willing sacrifice from the community, each person giving up 1 hour of their own life to extend yours by a proportionate amount. 50 people giving an hour each would grant you approximately 1 additional year. No, Kieran said immediately. We won't ask people to shorten their lives for ours. You won't ask, Thessaly said firmly, but we might offer. That decision can wait, though. First, you have work to do. And so began the most intense period of Elara and Kieran's lives. Elara established what she called the Garden Vigils, regular times when anyone in Thornhaven could come to the transformed grief gardens to process their losses with her guidance. She began training 2 apprentices, a young woman named Lissa, who had always been sensitive to others' emotions, and an older man named Fennec, who had survived the loss of his entire family and understood grief from the inside. She taught them the techniques of grief absorption, how to hold sorrow without being consumed by it, how to read the patterns of the grief map and understand what each person needed. She shared the breathing exercises that kept her grounded when the weight of others' pain threatened to overwhelm her, and the meditations that helped her separate her own emotions from those she carried for others. Kieran, meanwhile, was revolutionizing Thornhaven's relationship with its surroundings. Using his seed arrows, he planted groves of fruit trees around the settlement's perimeter, creating both a source of food and a living barrier that discouraged certain predatory creatures. He discovered that different seeds produced different effects. Some created plants that gave off scents that raven wolves found repellent. Others grew into trees that attracted helpful creatures, called harmony birds. Harmony birds were small, iridescent creatures that fed on negative emotions the way ordinary birds fed on insects. Where they nested, conflicts resolved more easily, arguments de-escalated naturally, and cooperation came more readily. They were drawn to the energy that Kieran's life-keeper were generated, and soon Thornhaven had a flock of them that served as an early warning system. When the birds fled, it meant something was approaching that generated emotions too dark and concentrated for them to feed upon. Kieran took on 2 apprentices as well. His sister Mira, whose natural talent for hunting translated well into the more nuanced work of life cultivation, and a teenage boy named Destin, who had a gift for understanding what people needed before they asked. Together, they began mapping the emotional geography of Thornhaven, learning where joy naturally gathered and where sorrow tended to pool, so they could plant life in the places that needed it most. As the weeks passed, the community began to understand what Elara and Kieran were building, a system where grief and joy weren't opposites, but partners, where loss was acknowledged rather than suppressed, and where new life was intentionally cultivated rather than taken for granted. It was a new way of living in Umbralis, one that accepted the realm's darkness, but refused to be consumed by it. And through it all, Elara and Kieran practiced their vigilance against the Despair Eater. Every night, they tested each other with questions only the real person could answer. They created what they called the Memory Vault, a shared collection of experiences so specific, so intimate, that no observer could possibly know them. The way Elara hummed when she was thinking deeply, the particular way Kieran's left eye crinkled slightly more than his right when he smiled genuinely, the phrase he whispered to her in moments of fear, "We're here, we're real." The way she always touched his shoulder twice, never once, when she needed reassurance. They built a language of gestures and inflections that was theirs alone, a vocabulary of intimacy that would serve as their early warning system when the Despair Eater finally came, because they both knew it would come. Creatures that hunted healers were patient, and Elara had made herself the most prominent healer in this part of Umbralis. The Despair Eater would find her eventually, but in the meantime they lived, fully, fiercely, with every moment counted and valued. 12 years might not be a lifetime, but they were determined to make it feel like one. Music shifts to a tone of quiet determination and bittersweet beauty. Part 8. Shadows Within Shadows. For months into their work, Elara discovered something that would change everything they thought they knew about Umbralis. She was tending to an elderly woman named Kieran in the Grief Gardens, helping her process the loss of her husband, when her grief map began to glow with an unfamiliar silver-blue light. The pattern on her arms started moving, shifting like living things, and suddenly Elara could see something she'd never seen before. Beneath Kieran's visible shadow, the one that moved with her body, there was another shadow, deeper and more fundamental. This was what the ancient texts called a soul shadow, the truest representation of a person's essential self. Unlike the binding shade that merged between lovers, or the regular shadow that followed the body, the soul shadow showed who someone really was beneath all pretense and self-deception. Most people could never see soul shadows, not even their own. But as Elara's abilities as Sorrow Shepherd deepened, her grief map had evolved to grant her this sight, and what she saw in Kieran's soul shadow shook her. It was fractured, split into three distinct pieces that orbited each other but never quite touched. Each piece represented a version of Katrin, who she'd been before her husband's death, who she was now in her grief, and who she feared she might become if she couldn't heal. "Your soul is trying to integrate," Elara whispered, understanding flooding through her. "The grief has fragmented you, split you into past, present, and feared future. That's why you can't move forward. You're literally not whole." This discovery opened up an entirely new dimension to Elara's work as sorrow shepherd. Grief didn't just wound people emotionally. In Umbralis, where shadows had heartbeats and emotions could manifest physically, grief could actually fracture the soul itself. Her role wasn't just to absorb and process sorrow. It was to help people reintegrate their soul shadows, to become whole again after loss had split them apart. She shared this discovery with Kieran that night, and through their binding, he immediately understood the implications. "If grief can fracture souls," he said slowly, "then perhaps joy can fuse them. Perhaps my work as life keeper isn't just about planting seeds and cultivating growth. It's about helping people's soul shadows stay integrated in the first place." Together, they developed a new practice they called the shadow dance. When someone came to Elara with grief that had fragmented their soul shadow, Kieran would work with them afterward, helping them reconnect with joy, purpose, and forward movement. The two practices balanced each other perfectly. Elara helped people release what they needed to let go of, and Kieran helped them embrace what came next. But the discovery of soul shadows also revealed something more troubling. One evening, as Elara was teaching Lissa and Fennec how to perceive soul shadows, she noticed that Soren, the lore keeper who had stayed in Thornhaven, had a soul shadow unlike any she'd seen before. It wasn't fractured, but it was strange. His soul shadow had what appeared to be edges, as if it had been cut and carefully reassembled, like a puzzle that had been taken apart and put back together. "What does that mean?" Lissa asked quietly when Elara pointed it out. "I don't know," Elara admitted, "but soul shadows shouldn't have seams. They should be seamless, whole. Unless Soren had undergone something that fundamentally changed his essential nature. In Umbralis, there was only one process known to cause such alterations: the remaking. This was an ancient, forbidden ritual that allowed someone to excise parts of their own soul, usually the parts they found unbearable, like guilt or shame or fear, and seal those parts away. The remaining soul could then be reassembled, creating a person who was technically whole but fundamentally altered. Those who underwent the remaking became what were called the unmade, people who had sacrificed parts of their essential selves in exchange for peace from whatever tormented them. But the cost was severe. The excised pieces didn't simply disappear. They manifested as entities called echo shells, fragments of a person that wandered Umbralis, seeking to reunite with the whole they'd been severed from. If Soren was unmade, it meant part of his soul was out there somewhere, possibly hunting him, possibly dangerous. It also meant he couldn't be fully trusted, not because he was evil, but because he literally wasn't complete. His judgment, his emotions, his motivations were all operating with pieces missing. Elara decided to confront him. She found Soren in the archives beneath one of the sentinel trees, surrounded by the texts and scrolls he'd been studying. His shadow-weave cloak was draped across a chair, and without it, he looked smaller, more vulnerable. "You're unmade," she said without preamble. I can see it in your soul's shadow. Soren didn't deny it. He simply set down the scroll he'd been reading and met her gaze. How long have you known? I only learned to see soul shadows recently, but now that I know what to look for. She sat down across from him. What did you excise? My capacity for attachment, Soren said quietly. 20 years ago, I loved someone. She died protecting a settlement from Veil Walkers. The grief nearly destroyed me. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. So I found someone who knew the remaking ritual, and I had them cut away my ability to form deep emotional bonds. That's why you're a lore keeper, Elara realized. You can observe and record without becoming emotionally invested. But Soren, where's your echo shell? What happened to the piece of you that was removed? His expression darkened. I don't know. That's why I came to Thornhaven. My echo shell has been quiet for years, dormant. But recently, I've felt it stirring. It's waking up, and when echo shells wake, they become dangerous. They don't understand that they're fragments. They think they're the whole person, and they're enraged at having been separated from the body. A chill ran down Elara's spine. You brought it here. You led your echo shell toward Thornhaven. Not intentionally, Soren said quickly. But yes, it's following me. I hoped that being near a sorrow shepherd might help. That perhaps you could help me reintegrate, restore what I cut away. I don't know if that's even possible, Elara said. The grief map gives me abilities, but reversing or remaking? That's beyond anything I've attempted. I know, Soren said, but if you can't help me, then when my echo shell arrives, you need to destroy it, because if it reaches me, if it forcibly reintegrates with me, the shock could kill me. Or worse, it could create something new, something that's neither fully me nor fully the fragment, something broken and dangerous. Before Elara could respond, a sound split the twilight. Not the warning bells this time, but something else. The harmony birds were screaming, their musical voices distorted with terror. Outside, Kieran's voice rose in alarm. Elara and Soren rushed from the archives to find chaos in the village square. A creature had manifested, humanoid in shape but translucent, like glass filled with swirling smoke. It wore Soren's face, but twisted, anguished, and it was moving through Thornhaven with terrible purpose, searching. My echo shell, Soren breathed. It found me faster than I thought possible. The echo shell was unique among Umbralis's creatures because it operated on a principle called resonance hunting. It could sense the person it had been severed from across vast distances, drawn to them by the fundamental incompleteness they both shared. But echo shells weren't just drawn to their original person. They were drawn to anyone who reminded them of what they'd lost. In Soren's case, his echo shell carried his excised capacity for attachment, his ability to love and bond. It would be drawn to anyone experiencing strong emotional connections. It would be drawn to Elara and Kieran, whose binding shade marked them as the most deeply connected people in Thornhaven. It's coming for you, Soren said urgently. Echo shells can absorb emotional bonds if they get close enough. They try to fill the void inside them by stealing others' connections. If it touches your binding shade, it could unravel everything between you. Kieran was already moving, positioning himself between the echo shell and Elara, his genesis bow drawn. But regular arrows would be useless against a creature made of soul fragments. They needed something that could affect spiritual rather than physical substance. The certainty charms, Elara said suddenly, pulling one of the phoenix feathers from her pouch. They dispel doubt, but maybe they can also dispel fragmentation. Maybe they can force the echo shell to recognize what it really is. A piece, not a whole. She didn't wait for confirmation. She stepped forward, holding the phoenix feather high, and felt its golden light pulse through her. The echo shell turned toward her, and for a moment she saw its true nature through her soul shadow sight. It wasn't evil, just desperate, aching with the loss of its other half, trying to fill an unfillable void. "You're incomplete," she called out to it, "but stealing others' bonds won't make you whole. There's only one way to heal. You have to reunite with Soren, and he has to accept what he cut away." The echo shell hesitated, its translucent form flickering. Through the swirling smoke inside it, Elara could see images. Soren's lost love, the grief that had overwhelmed him, the desperate decision to cut away feeling rather than feel so much pain. She understood then that the echo shell wasn't trying to hurt anyone. It was trying to get back to something it had lost, something it didn't even understand anymore. "Soren," Elara said, not turning away from the echo shell. "You have to accept it. You have to choose to be complete again, even if it means feeling the grief you tried to escape." "I can't," Soren whispered. "That grief will destroy me." "No," Kieran said firmly, stepping up beside Elara, their merged shadows strong and certain. "Grief only destroys when you face it alone. But you're not alone. We have a sorrow shepherd now. Elara can help you carry it." The echo shell moved closer, its attention divided between Elara and Kieran's binding shade, and its original source in Soren. It was like watching something starving trying to decide which food to consume first. Elara made the decision for it. She activated the certainty charm, and the phoenix feather burst into golden light that washed over the echo shell. The creature's form solidified, became more defined, and suddenly it could see itself clearly, see that it was incomplete, that it was searching for something it would never find by stealing from others. The echo shell turned toward Soren, recognition in its anguished face. Soren trembled, tears streaming down his cheeks, perhaps the first tears he'd cried in 20 years, the first real emotion since the remaking. The echo shell opened its arms, and Soren, after a long moment of hesitation, walked forward into its embrace. The reunification wasn't gentle. Soren screamed as 20 years of suppressed grief slammed into him all at once, as the capacity for attachment he'd excised flooded back into his soul. His soul shadow, which Elara could still see, writhed and reformed, the seams disappearing as the fragments fused back together. When it was over, Soren collapsed to his knees, sobbing with an intensity that shook his entire body. Elara knelt beside him, placed her hand on his shoulder, and did what sorrow shepherds do. She absorbed some of the overwhelming grief, took enough of it into her own grief map that Soren could breathe again, could function under the weight of what he was feeling. "Thank you," he gasped when he could finally speak. "Thank you for making me whole again. You'll carry this grief for the rest of your life now," Elara warned him gently. "There's no cutting it away again. Can you live with that?" Soren looked up at her, and his eyes, previously distant, observational, were now filled with real emotion, real presence. "Yes," he said, "because feeling this pain means I can also feel joy again, love again. I've been half alive for 20 years. I'd rather feel everything and be whole than feel nothing and be empty." That night, as Elara added Soren's grief to her grief map, a complex pattern that represented love lost and rediscovered capacity for feeling, she and Kieran lay together in contemplative silence. Through their binding, they shared a wordless conversation about completeness, about the dangers of cutting away parts of yourself to escape pain, about the courage it took to remain whole even when wholeness hurt. "We'll never be unmade," Kieran said quietly. "No matter how hard this gets, we'll never choose incompleteness over pain." "Never," Elara agreed. "We face everything together, whole and present." Their merged shadow pulsed with the mark of acceptance, and in its depths they could see their own soul shadows, not fractured like Kotran's had been, not seamed like Soren's, but truly whole and beautifully intertwined. Part 9. The Weaving of Fates. 6 months had passed since Elara and Kieran began their work, and Thornhaven had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The settlement felt lighter somehow, as if the accumulated grief of generations was finally being acknowledged and released. But with this transformation came new challenges and new mysteries. It was Destin, Kieran's young apprentice, who first noticed the strange phenomenon occurring in the transformed grief gardens. The memory blooms had begun producing something unexpected, crystalline droplets that formed on their petals like dew. But these weren't water. They were called sorrow crystals, and they contained concentrated emotional energy harvested from the grief that people released during the garden vigils. Each crystal was unique, its color and shape determined by the specific nature of the grief it held. Loss of a parent created deep blue crystals. Loss of a child produced violet ones. Loss of a dream or hope manifested as pale pink. The crystals were solid manifestations of processed sorrow, grief that had been acknowledged and released rather than suppressed. And they possessed remarkable properties. When planted in soil, sorrow crystals would grow into new types of plants, not memory blooms, but what the ancient texts called consolation vines. These were climbing plants with silver leaves that hummed softly when touched, and their presence had a soothing effect on anyone nearby. They didn't erase sadness, but they made it bearable, companionable rather than crushing. Kieran immediately saw their potential and began cultivating them throughout Thornhaven, creating living networks of comfort. But the sorrow crystals had another property that was both wondrous and concerning. They could be crafted into grief lenses. When one looked through a properly cut and polished sorrow crystal, they could see the emotional residue that lingered in places, the joy that had soaked into a wedding site, the terror that clung to a battlefield, the love that warmed a family's home. It was a way of reading the emotional history of Umbralis, of understanding the invisible currents that shaped their world. Elara began teaching this skill to her apprentices, showing them how to read these emotional residues to better understand what people needed. If someone came to her claiming they were fine, but their home showed nothing but grief residue for months, she knew they needed help whether they admitted it or not. However, one evening when Elara was using a grief lens to examine Thornhaven's surroundings, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Beyond the settlement's borders, in the direction of the Sorrow Mere, there was a massive concentration of emotional residue. But it wasn't grief or joy or fear. It was something she'd never encountered before. A void, an absence so complete it appeared as a black hole in the emotional landscape. She showed Kieran immediately, and through their binding, he felt her fear. "What could create something like that?" he asked. "I don't know," Elara whispered. "But whatever it is, it's moving. Slowly but steadily, coming toward Thornhaven." They brought their discovery to the Council of Echoes. Thessaly examined the phenomenon through Elara's grief lens, and her expression grew grave. "I had hoped we would have more time," she said quietly, "but it seems the nullity has awakened." The nullity, Thessaly explained, was one of the most ancient and least understood entities in Umbralis. It wasn't a creature in any conventional sense. It was more like a concept given form, an embodiment of emotional emptiness. While Veil Walkers fed on memories and Despair Eaters consumed identity, the nullity erased emotional significance itself. Anything it touched would lose all meaning, all purpose, all sense of mattering. A person touched by the nullity wouldn't die, but they would cease to care about anything, not in a depressed way, but in a perfectly neutral, absolute way. They would continue existing, but without any drive, any desire, any reason to do anything. They would simply be, until their bodies eventually failed from neglect. "What awakens it?" Kieran asked. "Paradoxically," Corvus said, his echo-touched memories providing the answer. "The nullity awakens when too much emotional intensity concentrates in one area. It's like a cosmic balance mechanism. Thornhaven has become a nexus of powerful emotions, deep grief being processed, profound joy being cultivated, the strongest binding shade seen in generations. All this intensity draws the nullity like a flame draws a moth." "How do we fight it?" Elara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You can't fight emptiness with force," Thessaly said. "The only way to combat the nullity is with what we call resonance anchors, objects or places so deeply imbued with emotional significance that they can withstand the nullity's erasure. And the most powerful resonance anchor is the fate weaving." Elara had heard whispers of fate weavings, but had never fully understood them. Thessaly explained. A fate weaving was a ritual where multiple people bound their destinies together intentionally, creating a collective future so intertwined that it became nearly unbreakable. While a binding shade connected two people's shadows, a fate weaving connected the life threads of an entire community. The ritual required each participant to contribute something called a destiny thread, a physical manifestation of their future, pulled from their soul's shadow through deep meditation. These threads would be woven together into a pattern that represented the community's collective fate. Once woven, the participants' futures became interconnected. Joy experienced by one would ripple through all, but so would suffering. They would prosper together or fall together. But they would never become meaningless, never succumb to the nullity's erasure. "It's a tremendous commitment," Corvus warned. "A fate weaving means you're no longer living just for yourself. Your choices affect everyone in the weaving. Your death would be felt by all. Your triumphs would uplift all. It's the deepest form of community that exists in Umbralis." "And if we don't create one?" Kieran asked. "The nullity will reach Thornhaven in approximately 3 weeks," Thessaly said. "And when it does, everyone here will lose the capacity to care about anything. The work you've done, the bonds you've formed, the hope you've built, all of it will become meaningless. The community will dissolve not through death or departure, but through simple, complete apathy. That night, Elara and Kieran called a gathering of all Thornhaven's inhabitants. They explained the threat and the solution, making it clear that the fate weaving was entirely voluntary. No one would be forced to join their destiny to others, but one by one, the people of Thornhaven stepped forward. Mira was first, her hand finding her brother's. "We're already bound by blood," she said. "This just makes it official." Then came Lissa and Fennec, Elara's apprentices, then Destin and the other apprentices of the Lifekeeper. The hunters stepped forward, then the craftspeople, then the elders. Even Soren, newly whole after his Echo Shell's reintegration, came forward. "I spent 20 years disconnected," he said. "I won't spend the rest of my life that way." By the time the gathering ended, 47 people had committed to the fate weaving. Nearly everyone in Thornhaven. Only a handful chose to abstain, either because they planned to leave before the ritual or because they preferred to maintain their individual fate, whatever that might mean in the face of the nullity. The preparation for a fate weaving took days. Each participant had to enter a meditative trance deep enough to perceive their own soul shadow, then extract a single thread of their destiny. Not their entire future, but a representation of it. The process was painful in a way that had nothing to do with physical sensation. It felt like pulling out a piece of yourself that was never meant to be separated, like removing something essential while remaining alive. Elara went through the process first, partly to show others it could be done, and partly because as a sorrow shepherd, she was most familiar with navigating the terrain of the soul. She sat in the transformed grief gardens, surrounded by memory blooms and consolation vines, and turned her awareness inward. Her soul shadow appeared to her inner sight, strong, whole, intertwined with Kieran's even in this deep meditative state. And from within it, she could see a glowing thread, silver blue like her grief map markings. This was her destiny thread, the path her life would take if nothing interfered. She reached for it with her consciousness and pulled. The sensation was indescribable. It felt like she was unraveling herself from the future, disconnecting from the predetermined path, so she could weave it into something collective. When she opened her eyes, she held in her hand a physical thread, not quite solid, not quite light, but definitely present. It pulsed with potential, with all the possible moments of her remaining years. One by one, the others completed the process. Some struggled more than others. Extracting a destiny thread required confronting what your future might hold, including your death. Many wept as they pulled their threads free, seeing glimpses of their final moments or their greatest regrets or their unfulfilled dreams. When all 47 threads had been extracted, they gathered in the heart of Thornhaven, beneath the oldest sentinel tree. The tree had produced a strange growth for the occasion, a loom made entirely from living wood, its frame grown specifically for this purpose. The sentinel trees, it seemed, approved of the fate weaving and wanted to support it. The actual weaving was performed by Thessaly, whose ancestral echo gave her access to the technique. She took each thread in turn, starting with Elara's and Kieran's, which were already partially intertwined, and began to weave them together. The pattern she created wasn't random, but deliberate. Threads that belonged to people with similar roles or relationships were placed near each other, creating clusters of connection within the larger whole. As the weaving progressed, those whose threads had already been incorporated began to feel it. Elara gasped as she suddenly felt the presence of everyone in the fate weaving. Not overwhelming, not intrusive, but there, like a gentle background hum of connection. She could sense Myra's fierce determination, Lys's compassionate nature, Soren's newly restored capacity for feeling. It wasn't telepathy or shared thoughts, but shared significance. She mattered to them, and they mattered to her, in a way that was now written into the fabric of reality itself. When the last thread was woven in, the completed fate weaving blazed with light, every color represented, every life path visible as part of a larger pattern. The sentinel tree's loom absorbed the weaving, drawing it into its own wood, preserving it forever. The pattern would remain there, a physical anchor that the nullity could not erase. "It's done," Thessaly said, and her voice carried the weight of multiple generations. "You are fate woven. Your destinies are one. When the nullity arrives, it will find not isolated individuals it can render meaningless, but a collective so tightly bound that erasing one thread would require erasing all threads. And that is beyond even the nullity's power." That night, Thornhaven celebrated, but the celebration felt different from past gatherings. People could feel each other in new ways, could sense the emotional ripples of joy moving through the fate weaving. When someone laughed, others felt a ghost of that laughter in their own chests. When someone felt grateful, that gratitude spread like warmth through invisible connections. But they could also feel the darker emotions. When old Garrett's widow, who had been fate woven with him, had a moment of grief remembering her husband, everyone felt a whisper of that sorrow. When young Torvin, still bearing the phantom pain of his ravenwolf bite, had a flash of remembered terror, others felt an echo of that fear. This was the reality of fate weaving. You shared everything, not just the good. You carried each other's joy and each other's pain, inescapably, permanently. Some found it overwhelming. Others found it comforting. The knowledge that they would never be alone in their suffering, never have to bear anything entirely by themselves. Elara and Kieran stood together, watching the celebration, feeling the web of connection stretching out from them to encompass nearly the entire settlement. Through their binding, they could feel each other's wonder and apprehension. 12 years, Kieran said quietly, referring to the Phoenix's prophecy. When we die, everyone in the fate weaving will feel it. I know, Elara said, but they'll also feel every moment of joy we create between now and then, every person we help, every bit of hope we plant, that will ripple through them too. 3 weeks later, the nullity arrived. It appeared as a space where everything simply stopped. Colors faded to gray, sounds muffled to silence. Even the eternal twilight seemed to dim. The void moved slowly across the landscape, and anything it touched lost all emotional resonance. But when it reached Thornhaven's borders, it stopped. The fate weaving held. The collective significance of 47 interconnected destinies created a barrier that the nullity could not cross. For 3 days, the void pressed against Thornhaven, testing for weakness, searching for a thread it could unravel. During those 3 days, everyone in the fate weaving felt the strain. The nullity's presence created a pressure, a whisper of meaninglessness that tried to seep through their connections. Some faltered, questioning why anything mattered. But when they did, they felt the others holding them steady, felt the collective conviction that yes, this matters, we matter, our choices and our loves and our work all matter. On the third day, the nullity withdrew. Fate weavings were too strong, too deeply anchored in significance. The entity moved on, seeking easier targets, isolated individuals who had no collective to protect them. Thornhaven had survived, but they had changed. They were no longer just a settlement of individuals who happened to live together. They were a fate-woven community, bound by destiny itself, their futures braided into a single, resilient whole. Part 10. The Legacy of Light and Shadow, 10 minutes. Gentle, unified harmony continues, with a tone of peaceful completion. 2 years had passed since the fate weaving, and Thornhaven had become something unprecedented in Umbralis, a settlement that thrived not despite its darkness, but because it had learned to honor both shadow and light. Word of their success had spread through the realm, carried by wandering lore keepers like Soren, and other settlements began sending representatives to learn their methods. It was during this time that Elara discovered she was pregnant. The revelation came not through ordinary means, but through her soul shadow sight. She could see a third presence within her own soul shadow, small and nascent, a new life taking shape. The discovery filled her with wonder and terror in equal measure. She and Kieran had believed children were too dangerous, given their circumstances, but life, it seemed, had other plans. When she told Kieran, their merged shadow flickered and pulsed with such intense emotion that everyone in the fate weaving felt it, a wave of joy tinged with fear, hope mixed with uncertainty. Within moments, their dwelling was surrounded by well-wishers, the entire community drawn by the emotional ripple of this new beginning. But pregnancy in Umbralis carried unique challenges. As the child grew within her, Elara discovered that it was already developing what healers called a proto-shadow, a preliminary form of soul shadow that would solidify at birth. The proto-shadow was visible to those with soul shadow sight, and it revealed something remarkable. The child was already forming connections through the fate weaving, already being shaped by the collective destiny of Thornhaven. This had never been documented before. No child had ever been conceived within a fate-woven community. The baby was becoming something new. Not just the child of Elara and Kieran, but in some sense the child of everyone in the fate weaving, touched by all their destinies before even entering the world. As Elara's pregnancy progressed, strange phenomena began occurring throughout Thornhaven. The sentinel trees produced a new type of fruit called promise blossoms, delicate flowers that bloomed only once every generation, appearing when new life was about to enter a fate-woven community. These blossoms had an unusual property. When someone ate one, they experienced a vision of the future they were helping to create, a glimpse of the world they were building for the next generation. Kieran was one of the first to eat a promise blossom, and the vision it granted him was both beautiful and heartbreaking. He saw their daughter, for the proto-shadow's shape suggested the child would be female, grown into a young woman, strong and capable, leading Thornhaven with wisdom beyond her years. But he also saw himself and Elara as they would be, older grayer, with only a few years left before the Phoenix's prophecy came true. They would see their daughter reach adulthood, but they would not see her middle years, her own potential children, the full flowering of her life. Through their binding, Elara felt Kieran's vision and shared her own. She had seen their daughter learning to be a sorrow shepherd, had watched her absorb her first grief, and wear her first grief map markings with pride and sorrow mingled. The girl would inherit both their roles somehow, becoming both shepherd and keeper, carrying on the work they'd started. The pregnancy also revealed something unexpected about the binding shade. As the child grew, Elara and Kieran's merged shadow began to change, developing what appeared to be a third component, smaller, still forming, but definitely present. Their binding shade was expanding to include their daughter, creating what the ancient texts called a lineage shadow, a family bond that transcended individual connections. The formation of a lineage shadow was considered one of the rarest and most precious manifestations of shadow magic in all of Umbralis. It meant that the child would inherit not just their parents' genetic traits, but also fragments of their abilities, their bond, their very essence. She would be born already partially bound to them, already connected in ways that went beyond ordinary family ties. But this gift came with the same cost as all shadow bonds. If Elara or Kieran died, their daughter would feel the shadow fragmentation as if it were happening to her own soul. The Phoenix's prophecy of their death in 12 years, now 10 years away, would not just take them from her, but would wound her in ways that might never fully heal. Thessaly, consulting her ancestral echo, found references to only 3 other lineage shadows in recorded history. In each case, when the parents died, the child experienced something called shadow mourning, a period where their own shadow became unstable, flickering between forms, sometimes showing the parents as they had been, sometimes showing nothing at all. The recovery took years, and some never fully regained their shadow strength. "We're condemning her to terrible pain," Elara said one night, her hand on her growing belly. "We know when we'll die, know that she'll lose us while she's still young. Is it fair to bring her into this world knowing what she'll have to face?" "No," Kieran admitted. "It's not fair. But life in Umbralis is never fair. We face Veil Walkers and Ravenwolves, Despair Eaters and the Nullity. Everyone here knows loss. Everyone here knows pain." He placed his hand over hers. "But they also know community. They know the fate weaving. When we die, she won't be alone. She'll have 47 people bound by destiny to help her through it." As if in response to their conversation, the child moved within Elara's womb, and both parents felt it through their lineage shadow, a small reassurance, a presence declaring itself, claiming its right to exist regardless of the challenges ahead. The months passed, and Elara continued her work as sorrow shepherd as long as she was able, though she had to modify her approach. She discovered that pregnancy affected her grief map in unexpected ways. The patterns on her skin began to shimmer with new colors, gold threads appearing among the silver. These gold threads represented what she called anticipatory joy, the happiness of expecting new life even amidst the processing of grief. This discovery led to a breakthrough in understanding the relationship between sorrow and joy. They weren't opposites, Elara realized, but partners in a dance, each one making the other more meaningful. Grief hurt more when you knew what joy felt like. Joy felt sweeter when you understood how fleeting it could be. The gold threads in her grief map represented this truth, that a sorrow shepherd who had never experienced profound joy couldn't fully help others process profound grief. Kieran, meanwhile, had been developing new applications for his Lifekeeper abilities. He discovered that seed arrows could be modified to grow memory trees, special plants that, when mature, would produce leaves inscribed with memories of important events. These trees served as living archives, ensuring that the knowledge and experiences of one generation would be preserved for the next. He planted the first memory tree in the center of Thornhaven, and its first leaves bore inscriptions of the settlement's transformation, the arrival of the Possibility Phoenix, the creation of the Fate Weaving, the survival against the Nullity. But he also planted a seed specifically for their daughter, a tree that would grow alongside her, recording her life in its leaves, ensuring that even after he and Elara were gone, she would have a record of her parents' love and hopes for her. When Elara finally went into labor, the entire Fate Weaving felt it. The collective consciousness that bound them all rippled with her pain, her effort, her determination. Women who had given birth before instinctively began breathing in rhythm with her. Those with healing skills found their hands moving through remembered motions, even from a distance. The community was, quite literally, laboring with her. The birth took place in the transformed grief gardens, surrounded by memory blooms and consolation vines, with the song of processing humming gently in the background. It seemed fitting somehow. This place that had once represented only loss and sorrow was now witnessing the arrival of new life, the ultimate transformation of what the gardens represented. When their daughter finally entered the world, her first cry rang out across Thornhaven, and everyone in the Fate Weaving felt a surge of protective love, so intense it was almost overwhelming. This child was theirs, all of theirs, bound to them by destiny before she'd taken her first breath. Elara and Kieran named her Aria, a word in the old tongue that meant song between shadows. Her soul shadow was visible from birth, strong and clear, showing the lineage shadow connection to her parents, but also showing faint threads connecting to everyone in the Fate Weaving. She was, as they'd suspected, something new, the first child born into a fate-woven community, shaped by collective destiny from the very beginning. As Aria grew, it became clear that she had inherited remarkable gifts. By age 2, she could see soul shadows naturally, without training. By 3, she was humming the song of processing without having been taught. By 4, she was instinctively using techniques from both Sorrow Shepherd and Lifekeeper traditions, as if the knowledge had been woven into her very being. But she also showed signs of the weight she would carry. Even as a young child, she had nightmares about loss, about her parents disappearing. The lineage shadow made her preternaturally aware of their mortality, and she would often wake crying, seeking reassurance that they were still there, still whole. Elara and Kieran threw themselves into their remaining years with renewed purpose. They trained Aria, but they also trained Lissa and Fennec and Destin, ensuring that multiple people could carry on their work. They documented everything, every technique, every discovery, every hard-won piece of wisdom, in journals that would be preserved in the memory trees. They also began what they called the Legacy Project. With only 8 years remaining before the Phoenix's prophecy came true, they wanted to create something that would outlast them, something that would protect Thornhaven and other settlements long after they were gone. Working with Soren and the other lore keepers, they began compiling a comprehensive guide to survival and thriving in Umbralis. It included information on every creature they'd encountered, every technique they'd developed, every hard lesson they'd learned. But more than that, it included the philosophy behind their work, that shadow and light must be balanced, that grief must be honored, not suppressed, that joy must be cultivated intentionally, that community and individual must support each other. The guide was inscribed on special paper made from pressed consolation vine leaves, paper that would last for centuries and could not be destroyed by any of Umbralis's common threads. They called it the Shadow and Light Codex, and they ensured copies were sent to every major settlement in the realm. As the years passed, travelers began arriving in Thornhaven specifically to learn from Elara and Kieran before their prophesied deaths. The settlement became a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to understand how to live fully in a dangerous world, how to love deeply despite certain loss, how to find meaning in the face of darkness. One evening, when Arya was 6 years old, she came to her parents with a question that showed how much she already understood. "When you die," she asked, her young voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "will I be alone?" Kieran knelt down to her level. "You'll never be alone," he said. "You have the fate weaving. You have Lissa and Fennec and Destin and 43 others bound to you by destiny. You have the entire community." And, Elara added, pulling their daughter close, "You'll have our lineage shadow. Part of us will always be with you, woven into your own shadow. When you need us, look at your shadow in the light, and you'll see us there. Maybe not the way we are now, but the essence of us, the love we have for you." Arya nodded, seeming to understand in the way that children born to fate-woven communities seem to understand things instinctively. "Will it hurt?" she asked. "Yes," they told her honestly. "It will hurt terribly. But pain isn't something to fear. It's something to honor, to acknowledge, to move through. That's what it means to be a sorrow shepherd, to know that pain is part of love, that grief is the price of deep connection, and that both are worth it." As the years continued to pass, Elara's grief map grew ever more intricate, covering not just her arms, but spreading across her shoulders and back, a living record of every sorrow she'd helped transform. Kieran's Genesis bow had grown as well, becoming a magnificent living sculpture more than a weapon, sprouting new branches with each life he'd helped nurture. There merged shadow, bearing the mark of acceptance, and now the lineage shadow connection to Arya had become something of legend in Umbralis. People spoke of it in hushed tones. The shadow that proved love could endure even in a realm of constant darkness. The shadow that had faced the Dreamweaver and the Possibility Phoenix and emerged stronger. On Arya's 8th birthday, with 4 years remaining before the Phoenix's prophecy would come true, Thornhaven held a festival unlike any before. It celebrated not just Arya's life, but the transformation of their entire community, the legacy that Elara and Kieran had built. People from other settlements attended, bringing gifts and gratitude, sharing stories of how the Shadow and Light Codex had helped their own communities. That night, as the celebration wound down and Arya slept peacefully in her bed, Elara and Kieran stood together beneath the oldest sentinel tree, looking out at the home they'd built, the community they'd forged, the daughter they'd brought into the world. "For more years," Kieran said quietly. "For years of mornings," Elara replied. "For years of teaching Arya. For years of helping people heal. For years of planting seeds, literal and metaphorical. that will grow long after we're gone. Through their binding, they felt each other's peace. They had chosen this life knowing its cost, and they would choose it again. They had loved courageously, with their eyes open, and they had created something that would endure. Their merged shadows stretched across the ground, and in its depths they could see three forms now, themselves and Arya, intertwined, inseparable even when physical separation eventually came. It was, they thought, exactly the kind of legacy worth leaving. As the eternal twilight of Umbralis settled into its deepest, most peaceful hour, Elara and Kieran returned to their dwelling, to their sleeping daughter, to the 4 years they had left to live fully, fiercely, and without regret. The story of the Sorrow Shepherd and the Life Keeper was far from over, but this chapter, the chapter of their becoming, their building, their loving, was complete, and it was enough. The end. May your own shadows merge with those you love, and may you face your darkness with open eyes and courageous hearts. Rest well, dreamer, in the knowledge that all shadows, even the deepest ones, are created by light.